On the second morning of battle, Xerxes sent word that he wanted to watch from the hillside above the pass. He had a throne carried up to the high ground, a seat from which the king of the largest empire on earth could observe his army finally break the Greek line and begin the march south toward Athens. His commanders had already thrown wave after wave of Medes and Scythians into the narrow gap between the cliffs and the sea. They had been driven back in disorder, their dead piling up in the approach to the pass. Xerxes then committed his immortals, the 10,000 elite soldiers who formed the personal strike force of the Achaemenid Empire. Men who had never once failed in battle. They went in, and they came back out again. The Greek line had not moved. Watching from his throne on the hill, the great king of Persia had mobilized an army that ancient sources numbered in the millions, had bridged the Hellespont itself to bring it to Europe, and had marched it across Thrace and Macedon to reduce Greece to rubble. He was now staring at approximately 15 meters of rocky ground that several hundred Greeks were simply refusing to give up. According to Herodotus, Xerxes leapt from his throne 3 separate times in frustration over what he was watching. So, how did a narrow strip of coast in central Greece turn the largest military expedition of the ancient world into a traffic jam? And how did the men holding that ground come to define what it meant to fight without any expectation of survival? The roots of what happened at Thermopylae go back a full decade, to a plain called Marathon, and a humiliation the Persian Empire could not absorb. In 490 BC, Darius I had dispatched an expeditionary force across the Aegean Sea to punish Athens and Eretria for their support of a revolt by Greek cities under Persian rule in Ionia. His force landed at Marathon, less than 40 kilometers from Athens. The Athenians, with a small contingent from the city of Plataea and no help from anyone else, attacked first and crushed the Persian landing force completely. The Persians who survived rode back across the Aegean. Herodotus records that Darius was so consumed by the defeat that he appointed a servant to remind him 3 times before every meal not to forget the Athenians. He began assembling a vastly larger invasion force and died before he could use it. His son Xerxes crushed a revolt in Egypt, consolidated his throne, and picked up where his father had left off, spending 4 years on preparations that dwarfed anything the Persian Empire had previously attempted. To move his army from Asia into Europe, Xerxes ordered 2 pontoon bridges built across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating the 2 continents. Each bridge stretched more than a kilometer, hundreds of warships lashed together, bow to stern with papyrus and flaxen cables, wooden planks laid across the decks, earth spread on top so horses would not spook at the sight of water beneath their feet. It took 7 days and 7 nights for the army to finish crossing. When a storm destroyed the first set of bridges before the crossing began, Xerxes reportedly ordered the sea itself whipped with chains and branded with hot irons as punishment. This detail, passed down through Herodotus, is impossible to fully verify, but entirely consistent with what other ancient sources describe about Xerxes' personality. And it captures something true about the scale of his ambition and fury. New bridges were built. He also ordered a canal cut through the Athos Peninsula to the east, where a previous Persian fleet had been wrecked by storms a decade earlier. A 2-year engineering project, completed entirely to avoid navigating around a single promontory. In the spring of 480 BC, his army began crossing into Europe. Modern historians estimate the invasion force at somewhere between 120,000 and 300,000 men, enormous for the ancient world even stripped of Herodotus's claim of 2 million, and trailing behind it a supply fleet of transport vessels that made the naval element of the campaign equally formidable. Against this, the Greek city-states that chose to resist faced the fundamental problem of geography and politics. Most of Greece, particularly the city-states to the north, had already submitted to Xerxes or stayed neutral. Athens and Sparta led the resistance with a coalition of perhaps 30 allied states, and their strategy depended entirely on finding terrain where the Persian numerical advantage could be cancelled out. The answer was Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass in central Greece, whose name translates simply as the Hot Gates, for the sulfur springs nearby. In 480 BC, before centuries of silting pushed the coastline outward, Thermopylae was a corridor barely 15 meters wide at its narrowest point, a thin strip of ground pressed between a sheer cliff face on one side and the sea on the other. An army of 300,000 could no more deploy in that space than it could fly over it. The pass had to be forced in a straight line, unit by unit, into a Greek formation that could face them in full strength, regardless of how many men waited behind. Command of the land force fell to King Leonidas of Sparta. He was one of Sparta's two kings, a man who had grown up in the agoge, the brutal state training system that took Spartan boys from their families at the age of 7 and did not give them back in any meaningful sense until they were adults capable of fighting and dying as a disciplined unit. Boys in the agoge slept on reed mats, were deliberately kept underfed to encourage resourcefulness, were trained to endure physical pain without complaint, and were taught to regard individual survival as a lesser concern than the integrity of the formation around them. Leonidas had lived that system from childhood, risen through it, married Gorgo, daughter of the previous king, and by ancient accounts, one of the shrewder political minds in Sparta, and by 480 BC was somewhere in his mid to late 50s, old for active campaign command. He received a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi before marching. Either Sparta would fall to the invaders, or one of her kings must die. He marched anyway. Herodotus records a detail about how he chose the 300 Spartiates who would accompany him that has struck readers for 2.5 millennia. He selected only men who had living sons. He was not picking survivors. He was picking men who had already secured the continuation of their family lines, because they were not expected to return. What is often lost in the retelling is that Leonidas did not march to Thermopylae with 300 men and nothing else. He marched with 7,000, a coalition force that included Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, Corinthians, Arcadians, and contingents from a dozen other city-states. The 300 Spartiates were the core of that force, the most disciplined and battle-hardened soldiers in the Greek world. But they were not alone at the pass for the first 2 days. Part of the strategy was also naval. The Greek fleet commanded by Themistocles of Athens fought simultaneously at Artemisium to the north, preventing Persian ships from simply sailing around the Thermopylae position and landing troops behind the Greek line. Thermopylae and Artemisium were two halves of the same defensive concept, and neither could work without the other. Xerxes arrived at the pass in late August and waited 4 days before attacking, hoping the Greeks would simply disperse when confronted with the reality of his force. He reportedly sent a scout ahead to observe the Greek camp and came away confused. The scout reported that the Spartans were exercising, combing their long hair, and going about their routines with complete calm. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king who traveled in his retinue, and asked what this behavior meant. Demaratus told him that when Spartans combed their hair before battle, it was a ritual signaling their readiness to die, and that every man in that camp intended to dispute the pass or be killed. Trine Xerxes did not believe him. He sent a herald, offering Leonidas the kingship of all Greece if he would lay down his arms and join the Persian side. Leonidas's answer, recorded by Plutarch, though the spirit of it runs through Herodotus as well, was 2 words: Molon labe. Come and take them. The first attack came from Medes and Scythians, soldiers from the heart of the Persian Empire, capable fighters by any normal standard. Leonidas had positioned his force not at the narrowest constriction of the pass, but at the slightly wider middle gate, where the Phocian wall ran across the gap. This was a deliberate tactical choice. By holding slightly more ground, the Greeks could rotate their contingents, keeping fresh men in the front line while exhausted soldiers stepped back. The Spartan phalanx, shields overlapping, bronze spear tips extending several meters in front of the line, fought in a system the Medes and Scythians had simply not trained to deal with. The Persian infantry at this period were lightly armored by Greek standards, relied heavily on bows and shorter spears, and had built their battlefield success on maneuver in overwhelming numbers, neither of which was available in 15 meters of space. The Medes came in and were driven back. Xerxes sent them in again. They were driven back again. Then he sent the Immortals. The Immortals were the elite standing force of the Achaemenid Empire, 10,000 strong, named for the Persian practice of instantly replacing any immortal who fell, so the unit was always exactly 10,000 men. They were not exotic troops to the Greeks or easily dismissed. They were, by any reasonable estimation, among the best soldiers of the ancient world outside the Spartan system itself. They attacked the middle gate and could not break through. The Greek line held through the first day as the pass filled with Persian dead. A Spartan soldier named Ineches, when told before the battle that Persian arrows would be so numerous they would blot out the sun, reportedly said that was fine, since then they would fight in the shade. Herodotus names Ineches as his source for this remark, though, as with most conversational quotes from ancient battle accounts, it is best treated as a memorable story rather than verified transcript. What is not in dispute is what happened to the men who attacked that first day. The second day followed the same pattern as the first. The Persians attacked, the Greek line held, and Persian casualties accumulated far more rapidly than Greek ones. Two of Xerxes' brothers, Abracomes and Hyperanthes, died in the fighting, a detail Herodotus records specifically, and which gives some indication of how much pressure the Persian command was exerting on the assault. After 2 full days, Xerxes was, by Herodotus's account, at a complete loss for what to do next. He had thrown his best men at this position twice and gained nothing. Then, late on the second day, a local man from Trachis named Ephialtes came to the Persian camp and offered Xerxes information he would have paid almost anything to have. Scott, there was a mountain path, the Anopia, that ran above the pass through the hills and came out behind the Greek position. Ephialtes knew it and would guide a force along it. The name Ephialtes has carried the stain of this act ever since. In Greek, the word became a synonym for nightmare and for the archetypal traitor who undoes from within what cannot be broken from without. Xerxes sent Hydarnes, commander of the Immortals, up the mountain path at dusk. Leonidas had stationed the Phocian contingent at the top of the path to guard exactly this approach. But the Phocians, surprised by the sound of footsteps through oak leaves in the pre-dawn darkness of the third morning, took the advancing column for the primary attack and withdrew to a higher ridge to defend themselves. The Persians did not bother attacking them. They simply walked past and continued down toward the Greek rear. Leonidas knew before dawn. A scout came in, then a deserter from the Persian camp. By early morning the council had met, and the decision had been made. The main body of the Greek alliance, 4,000 or 5,000 men, would march south. There were other defensive positions to prepare. The war was not over. Leonidas would hold the pass through the morning to let them get clear, and he would stay with whatever men chose to remain. The 300 Spartiates stayed. The Thespians stayed as well, 700 of them under their commander, Demophilos, by their own choice and without orders, despite having every opportunity to march south with the main force. This is worth being clear about because history, helped along considerably by Spartan propaganda that was already in circulation within a generation of the battle, turned Thermopylae into a story about Spartans alone. The 700 Thespians had no warrior caste mythology to uphold, no agoge, no centuries of martial identity at stake. They were citizen soldiers from a small Boeotian city of farmers and craftsmen, and every one of them could have marched south with the others and continued fighting the war from a different position. They chose to stay, and they were killed alongside the Spartans, and history largely forgot them, while the Spartans became legend. The Theban contingent of around 400 is a more complicated case. Herodotus suggests Leonidas kept them as hostages, suspecting their city of Persian sympathies, and when the final battle was lost, many Thebans reportedly surrendered and were spared. On the third day, Xerxes waited until mid-morning before ordering the final attack, timing it by Ephialtes' guidance for when the encircling force would arrive at the Greek rear. Leonidas moved his remaining force to the widest part of the pass, out from behind the Phocian wall, to give his men more room to fight. The outnumbered Greeks killed as many Persians as they could reach. Leonidas himself was killed in the fighting, early in the third morning engagement. His men drove the Persians back 4 times trying to recover his body, before they were finally pushed from the ground. The survivors fell back to a small hill at the rear of the pass and made their last stand there, fighting with broken spears, then with swords, and finally, according to Herodotus, with their hands and teeth, until the Persians ended the battle with a mass volley of arrows. Xerxes, reportedly still furious at the cost of what should have been a straightforward passage, ordered Leonidas' head cut off and placed on a stake to be displayed at the battlefield. Ancient Persian practice rarely involved such treatment of a fallen enemy commander. It speaks to what those 3 days at the pass had cost him. The pass was open. Xerxes marched south. Athens was evacuated and then burned. But the consequences of those 3 days of delay had already begun to take shape. The Greek fleet, freed from Artemisium once the pass fell, repositioned to the narrow strait at Salamis. In September of 480 BC, Themistocles lured the Persian navy into those confined waters, where the same logic that had served Leonidas at Thermopylae worked again. A narrow channel canceled out Persian numerical advantage, and the Greek triremes, fighting in familiar water, destroyed enough of the Persian fleet to make the invasion untenable. Xerxes, afraid of being trapped in Europe with his supply lines cut, withdrew to Asia with much of his army. A Persian force, left behind under Mardonius, was destroyed by a coalition Greek army at Plataea in 479 BC, ending the invasion permanently. At Thermopylae itself, a stone inscription was placed above the grave mound where the Spartans fell. The words are from the poet Simonides of C.O.'s, written within a generation of the battle itself, and still among the most translated lines of verse from the ancient world. Tell them in Lacedaemon, passer-by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. A bronze statue of Leonidas stands at the entrance to the pass today, his shield raised, looking north toward where the Persian army came from, the mountain rising behind him and the wide Malian Gulf below. The pass itself is gone, silted over by 2,500 years of river sediment into a flat plain where the coastal road runs without interruption. A mile of open ground between cliff and sea, where once there had been barely enough space for 2 men to walk abreast. It takes a real effort of imagination now to see what it was. A 15-meter gap where a small number of men decided how much ground they were willing to sell and at what price. What the Greeks held at Thermopylae was never the war. They lost the battle. The Persians walked through, eventually burned Athens to the ground and spent months occupying large parts of Greece. But Thermopylae bought the time that Salamis and Plataea needed to be possible. And it demonstrated something the Persian command had not previously encountered and did not know how to account for, that a force fighting on chosen ground behind a shared and accepted willingness to die could absorb far more punishment than its raw numbers suggested and inflict far more than an opponent with every material advantage had any reason to expect. That is why the pass at Thermopylae has never been forgotten, and why that inscription has been copied and quoted and translated in almost every language that came after it. If you found this one worth your time, the subscribe button is right over there.